Hello again, and thank you for listening to this presentation on data science for uncertainty quantification, shortly written as UQ. Data science has come a long way over the last 10-20 years. You could say that it comprises of three different fields. It would be statistical science, machine learning, and computer vision. In this presentation, I will focus on those types of data science that are really relevant to uncertainty quantification and the study of complex system for uncertainty quantification. The background for this book, for this chapter, can be found in the book again. That would be chapter 3, which is data science for geoscience. It's a very large chapter. It's about 120 pages long, so I'm not going to this presentation, not going to go in all the details of that chapter. Will be also subsequent presentations that will cover in more detail certain topics such as functional data analysis. In this presentation, I will focus mostly on dimension reduction and Monte Carlo, kernel methods for clustering, methods that are really relevant for studying and quantifying uncertainty, in particular when we are dealing with complex computer algorithms. To illustrate the various methods I will be covering, I will first present a small example that would be typical for the kind of examples of uncertainty quantification that we need to deal with, and then use this example to illustrate some of the methods developed. The problem here is a simple problem. It involves a purification system for drinking water extraction. So we have a river here on the right-hand side of this domain, and water from this river is pumped into this infiltration basin for purification. We know that the groundwater system can act as a purifier. So when water infiltrates in a basin and pumped out of the extraction well, then this water can be used for drinking water, for example. So the question, however, is that the area may have several possible contaminant sources. These could be from agriculture or industry. And so these contaminant sources is not going to affect the area when the basin is under an active filtration, but may affect the area when the extraction will stop pumping. Let me put the pointer option here. So when that happens, when this extraction well stops pumping, then the pressure barrier disappears and the contaminants may flow towards the extraction well. And so we need to understand how fast this happens and what happens when how fast the contaminants will flow to the extraction well when that happens. So this requires, of course, predicting the future behavior, and that requires then building a model. This model may contain many elements that need to be specified, such as heterogeneity of the hydraulic permeability, hydraulic conductivity, boundary conditions, and etc. And for that, we have data such as head data, possibly measurements of hydraulic conductivity, and measurements related to boundary conditions. Just as I mentioned in the overview presentation, there are many uncertainties we have to deal with. And so here we cut up the uncertainties into various parts. One has to do with the hydraulic conductivity representation. We have to model the geological system. And the other has to do with the boundary conditions in the system, which are uncertain as well. And then, of course, we also have measurement error. So without going too much into all of the details here, we're going to model hydraulic conductivity as a Gaussian process. So we have to specify mean probability, standard deviations, type of covariance model, etc. And we assume for this example that we have some a priori distributions on these various variables. The same for the boundary conditions, which we assume to be again a Gaussian process with a Martin covariance at the boundary that can then be estimated from the various head observations. Just like in the introductory presentation, we noticed that the model definitions are often very very complicated, involve many variables. But what we need in the end is quite simple. What we need, for example, could be the arrival time of the pollutant at the drinking well location, which is a scalar variable. Or if we want to know a little bit more in detail, we could require knowing the concentration over time of the same contaminants. Okay, probably this is one of the more important slides, at least in terms of starting the discussion about uncertainty quantification. So if we're going to do an uncertainty quantification and use a scientific approach, then we have to follow a certain set of steps. And the first step would, for example, deal with the definition of the model variables. So model variables are the ones that we showed before. They are the ones that represent the model and the uncertainty associated with them. So it is quite important to start out with making such a table of model variables and also to start specifying the probability distributions on them. So what we don't want to be doing necessarily immediately is to start worrying about estimating or inverting the model variables. The first thing we have to do is to do a proper definition of the various model variables. And this is often somewhat confusing. For example, if I model permeability or hydraulic conductivity, then a model variable is not necessarily the permeability or hydraulic conductivity of the grid cell alone. It also would invoke how that hydraulic conductivity or permeability is being modeled. So if that permeability is being modeled with a Gaussian process, then one of the model variables is the mean, the variance, and covariance of that process. And all these parameters are subject to uncertainty. So in the end, it's not just using some statistical algorithm to generate hydraulic connectivity. It's also about defining the probability distributions that go in and doing so and their associated uncertainties. The second type of variable we'd like to state or formulate are the data variables. So data variables are not observations. They're not field observations. This comes down here when we say observed data. The data variables are essentially the predictions made on the models of what the observations would be if that particular model, single sample or single model would be the true Earth. So this would invoke a forward function that models the data variables given a single model realizations. And this can be formulated for any kind of data, whether it is so-called hard data and geostatistics, or soft data and geostatistics, or potentially head measurements or dynamic data. For each one of those, we can formulate such forward function. The third important variable we have to formulate is what we would like to predict. So now in this particular case that we covered in the previous slides, the prediction variables were simply the predictions run on the models for the concentration as varying over time. So when dealing with uncertainty quantification and a systematic scientific view or approach to this, we have to really state clearly these various variables and clearly also state their various uncertainty distributions. If that's not done, then we later run into problems. It may be that data variables are confused with model variables, that certain model variables are already data variables, etc., etc. So it's very important to do this. It's also important to distinguish data variables from actual observed data. Remember that data variables are just a function of the model variables, and the observed data are whatever we have observed. So this also allows us later on to start comparing the observed data with realizations of the data variables, and we can start learning from the differences that we observe. Another thing we can do is we can start to understand the relationship between data variables and prediction variables, and try to figure out how much the data variables are informative about prediction variables, and then evaluate that for a specific instance of the observed field data we have. So let's formulate this a little bit more specifically with matrix algebra. So the model I will write as M, and the model is always seen as a vector of some size, and the size of that vector is capital N. So this is an important notation I will use throughout the entire presentation. So capital N is the size of the model. Then I generate often model realizations by Monte Carlo, drawing from distributions, and I get several model realizations with, which is indicated by this L here. And the amount of model realizations I generate will be capital L. An important observation, and this is an extremely important observation, is that in most of the practical cases that we do in subsurface uncertainty quantification, is that the model is size, namely capital N, is much larger in dimension than capital L. The reason for that is again very simple. You could say, well, in order to quantify uncertainty on complex models, I need an enormous amount of realizations, and this is indeed true. If we look at this from a statistical point of view, then if I want to quantify uncertainty on a very high dimensional variables, I need a lot of samples. But that's not what we need. In the end, what we need is making predictions. And so the type of predictions that we are trying to make, and I have alluded to that in the overview presentation, are often simple variables. They're functions, or they're scalars, or they're possibly a map. They're not the enormously complicated models that we're trying to build. These complicated models and the many realizations are not used to make decisions. People make decisions on some quantity of interest. As a result, the dimensionality I'm worried about in terms of statistical inference is essentially the number of samples in order to predict something in the future. So this is an important thing to note, namely that capital N is much, much smaller than capital N. And so this will have consequences for the kind of data science that we will be developing for uncertainty quantification. So I can put my models into this matrix, and on the row, we notice here this is dimension of N. So this would be the first realization of the model, and this would be the last realization of the model. So in the columns, we notice the realizations. So this would be the first realization of the first model component, and this would be the last realization of the first model component. I mentioned before that the data variables are essentially functions, forward functions of the model variables, and I write that here simply in this fashion, and therefore I can put the data also in the same matrix. It has a different dimensionality, of course, than the models. H I will use throughout the presentation as the prediction variable, so what we essentially trying to predict in the future. And again, I can make a matrix which has these various prediction variables. Again, notice that I differentiate data variables from observed data. The observed data is whatever we have recorded in the field. To do any mathematics or any data science, we have to define the space within which we will be doing that data science. And so in the previous slide, we saw that, let me put my pointer on again. In the previous slide, we saw that we essentially get a matrix, whether it is a matrix of models, data variables, or predictions. So I call this the data matrix. It's nothing to do with data in the field. It's just the information that is gathered either through modeling or forward function evaluations. So in order to represent all this information, we can now work in two spaces. There's a space of Rn. It's essentially the space of the model variables. So it means on each axis, I have a model variable. For example, I have the model variable 1, 2, etc. till n. So this space is very large. Remember in the previous slide, I mentioned that capital N is much larger than capital L. In this space, I essentially have L points. So for example, it could be that if you have a certain height and a certain weight, then I would have a scatter plot of these two. But since I'm looking at many, many attributes of the model, this dimensionality is very high, yet the amount of samples we have is very, very small. The second and alternative view of the same problem is to work in RL. That means in the sampling space. Now I look at one particular parameter, for example, your weight, but I look at this over many, many examples, L. And so I have essentially n points in the system. So here I'm working in a much lower dimensional space with many more data points. Again, if we want to take a mathematical approach, it's very important to define the space within which we'll do all our quantification. So often we need to rely on simple linear algebra simply because we have a lot of tools that are available to us. And such a linear algebra often works with Cartesian spaces, Euclidean distances, dot products, and eigendecompositions. And all these tools are very well understood. So preferably we'd like to work in that space. The question, however, is that whether a Cartesian space is actually appropriate for the type of variables that we deal with, and whether the traditional linear algebra that we're looking at, particularly those related to eigendecomposition, is practical for the type of problems we are needing to solve. So let's first talk about the counter space that we'd like to work in. We know that we have to deal with physical variables, and this is a difference between, say, uncertainty quantification related to human behavior or the human world versus the physical variable world. So when we deal with physical variables such as compressibility, resistivity, and frequency, we usually know that there is a reciprocal property to this. Consider, for example, two physical variables, resistivity and period. So if I have a system modeling both uncertainty and resistivity and period, then I have a question. Should I model in the space of resistivity and period, or should I model with the inverse, which would be here conductivity and frequency? If I would be using a Euclidean space, I run into problems. If I look at the Euclidean distance between, say, two realizations of resistivity and period, then this would be the definition of that Euclidean distance. However, if I look at the same Euclidean distance, but now for frequency and conductivity, then I have this definition. And obviously, because of the one is the inverse of the other, these Euclidean distances are different. So if those Euclidean distances are different, that means I'm solving the same problem in two different spaces, and I will get at the end two different uncertainty quantifications. And this is a problem because now the uncertainty quantification becomes a strong function of the kind of model parameterizations that we are taking. And so this is not quite logical. We know that uncertainty quantification has more to do with lack of knowledge and lack of information, lack of data, lack of understanding we have, and should possibly, it should not really be a function of the way I parameterize the model. A better choice of the model would be looking at log ratios. So if I use log ratios, then I know that whether I use conductivity or frequency or resistivity and period, I get the same distance. So this is one problem. The second problem, again, relates to the choice within which we need to work. So there are two choices, as I mentioned. One has to work in a very high dimensional space, n, and so making scatter plots, and from that calculating correlations, or in high dimensions it becomes covariance. And so the covariance is really related to the data matrix X transpose times X. Covariance is related to principal component analysis, has a relatively easy probabilistic interpretation. It's also a bijective mapping. So when I do a principal component analysis, what that means is I can reconstruct from the lower dimensional space, again, the original space. It requires an origin and is strictly using a Euclidean distance. On the other hand, we have the dimension L, which is a space defined by a dot product. So instead of having X transpose X, I have the transpose of that, which be X transpose. In that case, we're working with dot products and distances. So we'll be working with, instead of principal component analysis, we'll be using with multidimensional scaling. There's not such an easy probabilistic interpretation as we had with principal component analysis. The mapping in from the higher dimensional space to the lower dimensional space and back is an injective mapping. That means there's no unique reconstruction, once I'm mapped in a lower dimensional space to go back to the original space. And this could be a problem. For example, if we have a particular problem of very high dimension, we create a lower dimension representation of that, solve the regression analysis or any kind of analysis you want to do in this lower dimensional space, then evidently we would like to map this back into the higher dimensional space. With PCA, I have such mapping, I have such reconstruction, and I can quantify how well I'm doing this reconstruction. In multidimensional scaling, this reconstruction is not unique, and so we have an injective mapping. The nice thing, however, about using distances, dot products, and multidimensional scaling is that it does not require an origin because you're basically looking only at differences, and you can easily extend those spaces to non-Euclidean spaces. That means using very different dot products than the one here. We'll talk about that in a little bit. So in terms of generality for the type of uncertainty problems that we like to study, this could be quite useful as well, in addition to doing principal component analysis. So in the book, we talk about all the various math related to what is principal component analysis, what is multidimensional scaling, what are examples of non-Euclidean distance, etc. Instead of going over all the math, which you could just read either on in other resources such as Wikipedia, I would like to illustrate this with a number of examples. And I'd like to also illustrate it with the kind of examples that we would have. So for example, if we're dealing with a large amount of models, realizations, then I would like to see whether I can analyze these model realizations and reduce their dimension. So in my first example, maybe we'll put my pointer on. The first example, I was studying a set of models. In this case, a simple case of 1,000 realizations generated of a multivariate Gaussian distribution. The second set, I look at something completely different. So now I don't look at a computer-generated model or a set of images, but I look at some real images from a Flume experiment. In the last example, I look something more that would be relating to data or predictions we'd like to make. In this particular case, I was looking at 500 simulating DNAPL concentration curves. These are the concentration curves I showed you in the beginning for that particular case. So here's my first set. I've generated 1,000 realizations. It could be anything, could be hydraulic conductivity, porosity, whatever variable you're considering. And so to do this, I generated these models with a certain given mean, certain given covariance, which in this case, as you know, this is quite smooth covariance. So I generate a number of quite smooth realizations. So the question now is, if you have 1,000 realizations, say of 100 to 125, so it's 12,500 variables, can I reduce this amount of information, this gigantic matrix essentially of this data matrix containing all these models, into a much smaller matrix? So principal component analysis is essentially a method by which each of those images in the previous slide is going to be written as a linear combination of basic images. And these basis images or basis functions here are images, and they are the eigenvectors of doing essentially eigenvector decomposition on the covariance matrix of that matrix X. So there's this gigantic matrix X, do X transpose, multiply by X, and then do eigenvalue decomposition. So what it essentially is that we have now, say, a set of these basic images or basis images, and each one of the realizations previously is a linear combination of these. So we notice a number of things. First, we notice that this first principal component or eigenvector, let's say, consists basically, it seems, of some kind of average. That in the middle we have essentially a higher value, and on the side we have lower values. The second one vector would be a vector relating essentially to, notice the gradient. So it characterized the gradient in the image, where here you have essentially a filter that's high, as a high value here and a low value there. So you can also see PC as a filtering process. It's essentially saying that each image is passed through a filter, and with this filter comes a certain filter score, and from this filter score, which we'll see in the next slide, these scores then can be plotted into a plot. So I can plot the first score versus the second score, etc. We notice that as we go into higher dimensions, our filters are becoming more high frequency. So it also relates to Fourier series, where as we go in higher frequency, as we go increase the dimensionality, we get increasing frequencies. And so that means that with these higher dimensions, I can approximate the frequencies that I see in these various images better than, say, with lower dimensions or with less filters. So this slide summarizes some of that information into plots, and these two plots are quite important into what comes later. So as I mentioned before, principal component analysis is a method by which I can generate, in which I can represent a image as a linear combination of basis images, these eigenvectors of the system. So the more of these basis function I use, the more accurate my representation will be of the original image. And so in order to visualize that, I make what is called a scree plot. A scree plot is essentially telling me if I would be using only the first, let me put my pointer on again. If I'm using only the first dimension, that would be in the previous slide, that first eigen image, then I would be able to represent a certain amount of variance that I notice or I've observed between these images. And so you notice that with one component, I can only represent 10% of variance. As I increase the approximation of the original images by increasing the number of principal components or basis images, then evidently this variance will start to increase. And if I would be using as many principal components as I have images, I would reach 100% of variance. So it also means that if I would be using all of the eigenvalues and all of the eigen images, I will be perfectly able to reconstruct the original images. So often we'd like to take a certain cutoff for, say, I would like to represent at least 90% of variance in and I know that my approximation, I lose 10% of variance. And in that case, say if I take 88%, I will end up with 25 principal components. So another very important plot is a score plot. Remember that that every realization can be written as a linear combination of these images. So essentially these weights I give to each images are the scores that I have in this plot. So they will give the scatter plot of the first score for each image versus the scatter plot versus the second score of that image. So the amount of points I have, blue dots here, is the amount of images that I have, namely here 5, I think it was 1000. And so each dot in this score plot corresponds to one realization. Something that we'll do a lot as well is that we'll indicate from the scree plot, for example, here we see that 10% is the contribution of the first principal component, and then it is incrementally, it will be less, of course, it will be only 8%. So in this I'm looking at this plot, sorry, I'm looking only at 18% of the total variance of these images. So essentially don't be fooled too much by this scatter plot in particular when it's representing very little information. So that means that there are higher dimensions in which important information about the variabilities of these images is captured. I mentioned before that PCA allows for reconstruction. That means that I can write my original image and reconstruct it back as a linear combination of these basis images. And as I mentioned before, the more principal components I use, if I go from 2 to 10, 20, 30, 50, the better my reconstruction will be in terms of the original image. Okay, so this looks all very nice. Principal component analysis is a method by which I can reduce dimensionality of thousands of variables into much smaller amounts, say 25, and I can also reconstruct. The problem, however, in principal component analysis is it really only works for the kind of cases that we saw before. Rather smooth images, typically images that are generated with Gaussian process models, etc. When we go to other kind of applications, and particularly when we have to deal with discrete structures, such as shown in this particular example, or structures that have a strong sinuosity to them, strong curvature to them, then PCA is not very effective, and we will need a very large amount of dimensions to do that. In order to illustrate that, I'm going to show some example on overhead shots from my Flume experiment. It's the same experiment I showed in the overview presentation. So again, recall that we have a Flume experiment, which is essentially a tank in which fluids are moving. So there's about a 5 meter by 5 meter area in which we have deposition of deltaic deposition, essentially mimicking that. And so we take overhead shots every minute. For the sake of convenience, we turn these overhead shots into the area where we have water, essentially the blue area here. So that will be then become the black and white image here. So now I have 136 images, which is limited, of a quite high dimensional complex model. I don't know exactly how many pixels we have here, but let's say there are many, many thousands of these, if not hundreds of thousands of these pixels, pixels in this image. And we notice that we have very complex variation. So how can we do dimension reduction? Let's first look at PCA. So I can do, again, calculate the covariance matrix. I put all those images into a matrix X, calculate X transpose X, do eigenvalue decomposition, and look at what we have. And so you notice a few things. Again, we have the scree plot and the score plot. We notice that, for example, that in order to represent these images, previously with 25% to 25 components, I could reach 88% of variance. So now we notice that we are getting much less variance. What's also very interesting is that the first few principal components actually contain more information. Namely, previously this was 10 and this was 8. So now this is about 31% in the score plot. Another thing we notice about the score plot, it no longer has this nice structure of a scatter plot, which we typically expect for a Gaussian distribution. So previously I had a lot of models that were centered over here, and now we have models that are so clustering into several areas, and this will be very interesting to study later on. Again, as before, we'll use PCA to do reconstruction, meaning to using from a limited set of basis images to try to reconstruct the original image. Since PCA is a linear method, it uses a linear combination, you can understand that it's almost impossible to get back this original image, which was binary. So remember, our original images were black and white. So here, for convenience, I'll make them red and blue so I can compare them with the reconstructions. If we do linear combinations, we always get something that's not binary. We'll tend to get something that's much more smoother. And so we'll need an enormous amount of these components. In fact, we'll need all of them in order to reconstruct his original image. And that's the problem when applying PCA to more complicated cases. You could say, well, one of the ways to do that is to take a cutoff, take some kind of a threshold. That is true, but often in that threshold, we'll still lose information in terms of that original image, and it's basically also an ad hoc fix. It's not really a nice method to do. Okay, let's now look at something else, multidimensional scaling. So multidimensional scaling, remember we take our matrix X, instead of calculating X transpose X, I'm going to now calculate X transpose and use that to calculate eigenvalues. So because I'm working on a dot product, and basically because a dot product is essentially equivalent to a Euclidean distance that can go from one to the other, an MDS projection is essentially trying to approximate the Euclidean distance defined between the high dimensional model realizations with a Euclidean distance in a much lower dimension. So here, instead of working with variance, I'm trying to work with distance. I'd like to preserve the distance that I have. So if I calculate a Euclidean distance between, say, the Flume experiment images, I like to make a projection in lower dimensional space that also has that also creates the same kind of score plot. So in this score plot, instead of now these are still images, but I'm looking at here is trying to preserve the Euclidean distance between these two images. Recall that in principal component analysis, the idea is essentially with increasing amount of these basis images or principal components, I can approximate better and better the original images. That's not the focus of multidimensional scaling. In multidimensional scaling, we'll try to approximate the distances between these images rather than the images themselves. And so you could start to understand that by doing this, that this is more relevant for uncertainty quantification, because in uncertainty quantification, we're more interested in differences and distances rather than individual absolute realizations. So then the question is, how well am I doing this approximation? So in the previous slide, I showed you a two-dimensional plane within which now the images were mapped. And so I can calculate two-dimensional Euclidean distance and compare that with my original, which is a very high-dimensional Euclidean distance. As you notice that in 2 dimensions, I have a very poor approximation. The higher dimension I go, the better my approximation will be. However, you notice that with my original Euclidean distance, I have a very hard time approximating these distances, and particularly if you notice the very small distances. And that makes a lot of sense. It's easy to map things in a lower dimension where the large distances are preserved, but really the nitty-gritty sort of arranging of these models into close distances from each other becomes much harder to do. And so the question is then, are there better distances than Euclidean distance? Can I formulate a distance, first of all, that's more meaningful to the images I'm trying to study, and we'll see that in a bit. And secondly, with that more meaningful distance, can also project it in a much lower dimension, say than here, 70 dimensions, and to go to 7 dimensions to get a somewhat reasonable result, and even that is not very satisfying. One such distance we'll be using is the modified Hausdorff distance. Why do we use the modified Hausdorff distance, also called MHD? The reason is that in this kind of discrete cases, we're really looking at comparing objects, geometrical shapes with each other, because we have really distinct shapes of these channel objects. So one way of doing that is the modified Hausdorff distance. It's a distance that actually looks at what's the distance between one object and another object. And the way that is done is very simple. It looks at, it takes an object like this one here, and it creates the edge. So we have to do some kind of edge detection. So once I have the edge detection, I look at which point, I look at the distance between a point on this object, the red object, let's say it, and the green object. And you notice that for each point, I can calculate the minimum distance, right? So this would be for that point, this point would be the minimum distance, because from here to here, we go much further. And so I can do this also for the other objects. And then I calculate basically the average of that minimum for each one of them, and then I take the maximum over the two. So why do I do this? Well, if I would just use this one, I have an asymmetric distance, namely the distance from one to the other is not the same as from 2 to 1. So when I take the maximum, then clearly I have something that's asymmetric and I have something that follows the definition of distance. So here's a small example. We have here three cases. One is this diagonal line. One looks like the number 7, the other looks like the number 4. So it's clearly visually, by visual inspection, we can see that this image is much more similar to this image than this image. That's sort of what the eye sees. A Euclidean distance is not effective at detecting this, simply because a Euclidean distance actually compares the amount of overlapping pixels. And it turns out, by accident perhaps, that this has more overlapping pixels with this, and so has a smaller Euclidean distance. If I, however, take these bodies and make the edge, or create the edges of it, and calculate the Hausdorff distance, we notice now that the modified Hausdorff distance is much smaller between this and that than between this and that. So it seems the modified Hausdorff distance for this kind of cases is a much better distance to discriminate the variations that we see in these images, and that the Euclidean distance is not a very good distance. Just like before, I can make a scree plot and a score plot. And remember that in the score plot, let me put my pointer on again. In the score plot, we're looking at each dot being an image from the Flume experiment. And we also noticed that previously this was 20%, say, I think, and 11%, or this was 21%. We're looking already at a much higher amount of information. So now we're looking at over 40% of information. We also notice that we get a nice clustering in this plot, which we'll talk about later on, has consequences in terms of dimension reduction. The nice thing then is that by choosing a different distance, a more meaningful distance, and so meaningful in terms of detecting the differences between the various images, they also get a better approximation in lower dimensions. So here we notice the same scatter plots between the Euclidean distance that I calculate and the original distance, which is now the modified Hausdorff distance. And you notice that that I need much lower dimensions to get a reasonable approximation of these distances. And indeed, for even 20 dimensions, I get a good approximation, a good correlation between the lower dimensional Euclidean distance and the original modified Hausdorff distance. Okay, so let's recap a little bit. We've studied basically two spaces, the space Rn, the dimension of the model, and the space Rl, dimension of the number of realizations. We have discussed how the first space deals with covariance, principal component analysis, and that dimension reduction is achieved by replacing higher dimension n with lesser scores. When you go to RL, we have a different story. We work with the dot product, possibly other type of dot products, and we do multidimensional scaling. In the next slide, a couple of slides, I will show you how this traditional dot product, the Cartesian one, can be replaced by any type of dot product. Which is with this function phi here. Now dimension reduction is achieved differently. What we will do is not reduce the dimension of the model, but reduce the amount of models that we'll be carrying forward in order to do so. So here the dimension reduction is achieved by essentially replacing a larger amount of model by a smaller set that is essentially capturing the variability in those original models. And to do that, we need to have that distance. Recall that in multidimensional scaling, and this is again the same case with Flume experiments and the Hausdorff distance, we operated within this lower dimensional space where each dot in that space represent a Flume image, and so dots that are closest to each other will have images that look similar. So we already now see that within this space we have a grouping that's occurring. And so if there's grouping occurring, that means essentially that there's a large amount of images that are similar to each other. So then begs the question, can we replace essentially that group of images by a representative image, for example, by taking a midpoint in this group as representative image? In doing so, then the dimension reduction is not on the image itself, which remember with PCA was very difficult to do because we have a discrete realization. So approximating this with PCA would amount to changing the image completely. Instead here we selecting a few images. The question is how few should we be selecting? And again, that's an optimization problem. We want to select as few as possible, but not such that we lose a significant amount of information. So one way of doing that, this is essentially unsupervised clustering, is to calculate what's called the silhouette index. And the silhouette index looks at this balance between the variability within the clusters I define and the variability between the clusters that I have, and to come up with some kind of optimum. And so what we notice here, if we evaluate the silhouette index, we notice that about 5 clusters provide you some kind of optimum in terms of representing that variability. And so these are then these 5 realizations. So essentially what it says is that I can replace the 136 images with only 5 realizations and represent the same kind of information. Another application of the same idea is to find ranking in images based on distances. So here we have a simple problem of having a number of realizations. And it seems like there's no real real noticeable similarity, but in fact there is. And the reason why this is that the way I've constructed these images in a very purposeful way. Namely, I start with an image, say S1, and I construct a new image based on doing a linear combination of another image S2. So in geostatistics, this is known as gradual deformation. I basically deform an image based on the parameter theta, and if theta is small, then the new image will look a lot like the first image, and if theta is large, then the new image will look a lot like the second image. So what I have is basically I have a natural ranking between these images. But now imagine that I don't provide this natural ranking, and so just give you 1,000 of these realizations between S1 and S2. Can you find back the original ranking? And the answer is yes. With the way I do it, it's very simple. I calculate distances between those images, and I map it into a multidimensional scaling space. So again, I do multidimensional scaling based on their distances. And you notice immediately that the images are ranked along this circular line. And so in order to retrieve that circular line, I can just run a simple method such as self-organizing maps to do that. And so what I've now done is I've found ranking within these realizations. And you notice that this can now be done for any type of realizations or any type of set. It doesn't have to come from this particular gradual deformation case. I will likely not get a nice perfect ranking like this, but I'm very likely to get something of a spread around this this kind of linear, or let's say semi-curvilinear relationship. And that allows me then to rank these realizations, which is actually quite useful later on if you would like to do things like sensitivity analysis or finding out how important spatial uncertainty is with respect to other types of uncertainties in the system. Let's now return to the realizations of the DNAPL curves. So here in this plot, we see again the plot I showed you in the very beginning, which were the realizations of the concentration curves. In order to do dimension reduction, I have two options, or many options. One of those options to do principal component analysis. So in principal component analysis, we'll have to discretize these curves over time. So if I want to discretize, I can take a data point every hour, which leads me to a 1200 dimensional vector for each curve, and so for each curve, you have 1,000 vectors. I get 1,000 times 1,200. With distances, it's probably a little bit easier because I simply calculate the Euclidean distance between these curves. There's no need for discretization. But in this case, whether I do MDS or PCA, because of the nature of the variability of the curves, I get very similar result. And one of the things we notice is that with 2 dimensions, I can represent almost all the variability. And that makes sense, right? These curves are not very different from each other. Probably there are only a few parameters that are mattering, which is the breakthrough and where the curve level off, but in between they're not doing much difference. Regardless, when we look at this plot, it's not very well organized. Remember in the previous slide I showed you a nicely curvilinear organization. And so one of the way of achieving this is to essentially do a kernel transformation. In kernel transformation, or kernel methods, what we're doing is we're changing the dot product of the space within which we're working, and we say instead of working with x transpose, I work with some function of the two. Now, one of the important things to note is that these functions themselves are very hard to determine, and we don't have really expressions for them because these are high-dimensional functions. But what we can make expression of is the dot product of these functions, and that is called the kernel. So the kernel trick is to avoid essentially calculating this function, but only working with its dot product. And so here's one particular kernel function, and a mini kernel function, which is the radial basis function, where I use a Euclidean distance between 2 points and some measure of variance. And so this fits really well within our framework because we have already calculated Euclidean distance in lower dimension. So we can just plug that into this equation. Now we have a new distance function because our basically new dot product. So I can calculate, again, using multidimensional scaling, a lower dimensional representation. And as we notice, when we do this in 2 dimensions, we get this nice curve here, which is very much more interesting than this curve. And if I go to higher dimensions, I get this nice spiral. So one of the nice things about this kernel dimension or the kernel space is that by actually increasing the distance, you can start to embed your data in a high dimensional space within which you have much more linearity. For example, you can easily imagine a plane that contains the spiral, and so then I have achieved dimension reduction as well. So here we return to the other problem, other case that we were studying, which is ranking images, which are much more complicated than, for example, ranking of those curves or ranking of simple realizations. So again, I calculated the Hausdorff distance, which allows me to calculate the multidimensional scaling plot here. In this plot, I have a Euclidean distance between any 2 points, and so this is this Euclidean distance. I plugged this in this equation, which is my kernel function, just basically a distance matrix, and again do multidimensional scaling, and I get this ranking here. And so what we notice is that this very complicated plot is now essentially transformed into a very simple curve along which I have my images ranked. And so I can, for example, select representative cases for that. So returning again to the DNAPL case, I can go much further. Once I've done multidimensional scaling and I've created this multidimensional scaling plot, what I can start doing is to color each of those points in that plot with a parameter that was used to generate that particular response. So for example, if I look at the K-mean, which is the mean permeability or mean hydraulic conductivity, that parameter was varied, which led to a variation in this curve. It also led to these colors that we observe in this plot. One thing we notice is very important, is that this color is not random. That means that there's a systematic variation of K-mean within this space. It also means that, logically, that K-mean is a sensitive variable to this particular response. So later in sensitivity analysis, and this will be in one of the next presentations, we'll use this idea to quantify sensitivity of all the variables and even interacting sensitivities between the variables based on this very simple idea. Another idea that we'll explore later on in later presentations is that I can use this information to immediately update the prior distributions of this K-mean. We notice, for example, that in this plot, that if I had some kind of observation, let's say this is the red curve, I can also plot this red observation into this plot, which is the black cross here. And if you notice that the black cross and what's around that cross, we notice that there are more green points and red points than there are blue points. So this means that it's more likely that K-mean has a higher value on average than, say, as predicted from the prior distribution or prior assumptions that you made. In that case, it would believe it was a uniform distribution. And so indeed, if you look at, here we see the prior distribution. It's almost a uniform distribution. We can calculate, and we've done a simple calculation with Bayes' rule, which is something that we'll come back to in later presentations, that I can update immediately the uncertainty on that K-mean from this observation into this posterior distribution without actually doing any inversion. And so to do that, we needed to, for example, calculate the likelihood distribution, which is basically a smoothing of that K-mean within that multidimensional space. So you notice that dimension reduction is nice because it allows us to do very simple things, but also do very simple analysis, such as sensitivity analysis, updating of parameters, uncertainty, etc., in a very elegant and also very understandable fashion. So as I mentioned before, this will have application in sensitivity analysis, where for very complex cases with lots of parameters, we'll be able to rank sensitivities of various parameters. This is for a contaminant remediation case, from parameters that are very sensitive to responses to parameters that are absolutely not sensitive to responses. Okay, that's it. Thank you for listening. Just a few points to take away about this first introductory presentation to basically about spacing, dimensionality, reduction for these kind of problems that we're dealing with. In later presentation, we'll focus more on sensitivity, importance sampling, sequential importance resampling, and other types of themes. I think the most important point to take away is that in our world of uncertainty quantification, we're dealing with a very specific situation. That means basically that the amount of models we'll ever generate are much less than the dimension of the models that we have. And the reason for that is that the kind of prediction that we'd like to make from these models often is of simple nature, as a scalar, a vector, or function. We also notice that the traditional way of viewing dimension reduction through covariances is one particular way, but we also notice that often distances and dot products, kernel methods, appear to offer also greater modeling flexibility, particularly when you're dealing with complex high-dimensional objects, geometries, which we often have to deal with in the kind of spatial models that we are dealing with. So this dimension reduction is quite critical, because if we're going to work on uncertainty quantification, such as running Gaussian process regression, or any kind of other method, then we have to, a good strategy is then to reduce dimension and apply in those reduced dimensions the standard statistical methods. That makes it all very computationally feasible. It also makes it much more insightful. I think I've shown you a few plots where we already got a lot of insight in the nature of the problems that we're dealing with. So you notice also that a lot of driven by Monte Carlo, we're generating many realizations, so that's this L here, and we try to understand and learn essentially what the nature of our problem is, what parameters are important, what parameters are not important, and then lead to dimension reduction. So in later presentation, I will come back a lot to this notion of Monte Carlo. We'll also come back a lot to the nature of the prior distributions. I did not talk about that in this presentation. I've talked a little bit about that in the introductory presentation, but there will be a presentation on Bayesianism and Bayesian modeling in particular that will talk a lot about this prior distribution. Okay, thank you for listening again.